Dr. Tara Swart is not a fringe mystic. She is a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and senior lecturer at MIT who spent years signing off on patients being treated for what she once called delusions of hearing from the dead. Then her own husband died, and she began experiencing those same things herself. Instead of dismissing it, she turned her grief into controlled investigation, so drawing on brain scans, studies of perception, and new research into consciousness. Some resuscitated patients, for instance, have recalled details they couldn't have physically known. Evidence like this doesn't prove the impossible, but it may force us to rethink the edges of life and death. And for Dr. Swart, the shift from scientist to widow was not abstract. It was a secret she could no longer ignore. The secret she couldn't ignore. The secret she couldn't ignore began the moment her personal life fractured in ways that science alone could not soften. When her husband died, the grief that followed was not an object to be studied. It was raw, all-consuming, and accompanied by sensations she had once labeled clinically, voices, symbols, and visions that she had spent years categorizing as symptoms in other people. This immediate disorientation clashed with everything her training had taught her. For years, she had helped construct systems that stabilized patients, sometimes even removing them from their ordinary lives when their claims seemed too far outside consensus. Now, those same experiences were happening to her. She was not delusional, not incapacitated, but fully aware of thought patterns that looked indistinguishable from what psychiatry often calls psychosis. She has admitted she half feared she was slipping into that category herself. Yet she also knew she was grieving, lucid, and capable, and still, the impressions persisted. The conflict was sharp. How could she, a scientist who had worked under strict diagnostic guidelines, navigate dreams that felt like conversations or signs that carried the force of intention? Denying them outright required labeling herself ill, while accepting them and admitting her professional framework might be incomplete. That realization gave her a more sober empathy for patients she once judged. Perhaps their experiences had not all been mere malfunctions of the brain. Perhaps grief, trauma, or altered states could open windows science had yet to describe. So she did what scientists do. She set up observations. Rather than file her moments of connection away as superstition, she decided to collect them. She kept logs of dreams, marked coincidences, recorded the sensations that felt like signals, and paired those personal journals with concrete lab tools, tracking physiological states, brain responses, and her own perception under different conditions. By approaching it both as subject and scientist, she created a framework where her grief could be treated as data instead of dismissed as disorder. This was not a withdrawal from her discipline. It was a test. Could the brain under extreme stress enter altered states that reveal genuine aspects of consciousness? Science already accepted frameworks for psychedelic perception, sleep disruptions, and psychotic hallucinations. What if bereavement was another form of altered consciousness, one that might uncover something real rather than illusory? Every step raised the stakes. The more she cataloged, the clearer it became that these events were structured, not random. For her, the question shifted. Not whether she was inventing comfort, but whether consciousness itself might survive beyond biology. And if that possibility existed, then it should leave traces, patterns the brain could register, signals perception might catch, correlations that could be mapped in controlled study. Still, she knew the professional risk. Scientists who explore what's outside accepted boundaries are often dismissed, sometimes permanently. She did not want to abandon the tools of her field. She wanted to use them more rigorously to push their limits. If the brain could perceive more than we currently chart, then observing grief might be the starting point for a larger expansion of human knowledge. By staying grounded in method rather than belief, she carved a path between despair and denial. Her private loss forced her into an experiment that most of her colleagues would never attempt. And as her data filled with impressions, both subjective and measurable, the focus sharpened towards something even more radical. Perhaps our ordinary picture of human sense and perception is only the beginning, a simplified version rather than the whole map. If her experiences hinted that consciousness might not be bound by simple definitions, then maybe the senses we rely on daily are just the surface. What if the human brain carries far more ways of knowing than the handful we were taught in school? From 5 senses to 34. Most of us grow up believing humans only have 5 senses. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. It sounds neat, it's easy to memorize, and it feels complete. But neuroscience shows that picture is drastically simplified. Dr. Tara Swart cites research suggesting humans do not operate on 5 senses at all, but on as many as 33 or 34 distinct sensory modalities. Some of these are familiar, others run quietly in the background, yet altogether they form a far more intricate network of perception than the schoolbook model ever suggested. Researchers still debate how best to define and count them, but the underlying point is shared. Our sensory life is far richer than we usually acknowledge. When most people imagine the senses, they think of external input, the color of light, the pitch of a sound, the feel of a surface. But a large category of our sensory systems is interoceptive, concerned with monitoring the hidden state of the body itself. These include detectors of blood acidity, oxygen and carbon dioxide balance, hydration, glucose levels, even subtle regulation of internal pressure. These streams of input stay below attention most of the time, yet they are vital for survival. Without their constant feedback, your basic physiology would collapse long before you became aware anything was wrong. Some of the extra senses are easier to picture. Balance is governed by the vestibular system in the inner ear. You rarely think of it as a sense, but without it, standing upright or walking down a staircase would be impossible. Proprioception, your ability to know where your limbs are even in complete darkness, is another. You can scratch your back without looking, or grab a glass beside you without aiming, because this sense is active. Thermoreception warns when the environment is too hot or too cold. Nociception produces a sharp signal of pain when tissue is damaged. Each one is as essential as sight or hearing, but remains mostly absent from the way we're taught to think about the body. Then there are the subtler forms of sensing. Specialized receptors constantly monitor blood chemistry. Cells detecting the falling oxygen levels trigger adjustments in breathing. Changes in sugar concentration can drive hunger. The feeling of thirst is not a vague emotion, but a signal produced by cells measuring hydration status. Together, these signals operate as a vast stream of biological data feeding upward toward the brain. Most people think of these as simple feelings, but they are measurements as precise in their own way as vision or sound. This raises an obvious question. If this many signals are pouring in, why does awareness settle on only a fraction of them? The answer lies in the filters of the brain. The nervous system has protective gates that push most signals below conscious awareness and allow only the most survival relevant to be noticed. Without them, daily life would be impossible. Imagine trying to cross a street while simultaneously processing the acidity of your blood, the degree of stretch on each tendon, the ambient temperature change on your skin, and the faint rumble in your stomach. The filtering mechanism allows functionality, but it also means the version of the world you experience at any given moment is not complete reality. It is a curated display trimmed down for efficiency. The point becomes clearer with practice. Close your eyes and spread your arms. Instantly, you know their position though you weren't paying attention a second ago. That's proprioception coming forward. The same goes for your heartbeat. Most of the time you don't feel individual beats, but through stress, meditation, or deliberate training, some people can become acutely aware of them. Interoceptive channels that usually run in the dark can be drawn into awareness under certain conditions. Training can shift these thresholds. Experienced meditators often describe fine-grained awareness of breathing cycles, subtle shifts in pulse, or transient body sensations. Athletes sometimes report the ability to feel the difference between safe exertion and the earliest signals of muscle damage before any pain arrives. Neuroscience increasingly suggests these aren't special talents but amplified awareness of systems everyone possesses. The distinction is not capability but attention. When people speak casually of a sixth sense, it sounds mystical and singular. But Swart argues this overlooks what is already mapped by science. Dozens of senses, not just one. Intuitions, gut feelings, or sudden hunches may reflect hidden streams of information breaking the surface, not magic. For example, your unconscious sensors may register microfluctuations in another person's breathing, faint changes in blood chemistry, or shifts in body language. The brain interprets without presenting the raw data, leaving only a vague impression that feels like instinct. What seems extraordinary may be another form of ordinary sensing, routed differently. Recent imaging studies strengthen this idea. Experiments at Yale in 2025 showed that when subjects paid focused attention, different sensory modalities lit up overlapping subcortical hubs. In other words, vision, touch, balance, and interoception all feed into shared brain centers where awareness emerges. This means the senses are not isolated systems so much as multiplex inputs converging on common neural hubs. It also explains why changes in attention or altered brain states can make perception feel expanded or unusual. The body is always feeding in more than 5 channels. The mind selects what becomes visible. Understanding this brings real consequences. Medicine has long relied on recognizing hidden senses for diagnosis and treatment. Interoceptive misfiring can trigger panic attacks where patients feel they are suffocating, though their breathing is fine. Damage to proprioception can cause people to lose orientation of their bodies, even when eyes and ears remain intact. The expanded sensory map guides clinicians toward clearer explanations of symptoms that under the outdated 5-sense model would remain mysterious. But the psychological impact may be even greater. Realizing that perception is built on 30-odd senses, most hidden from attention, makes unusual experiences less suspect. You might sense tension in a room not because of anything occult, but because unconscious channels have picked up shifts in breathing patterns or muscular readiness among the people there. You might feel atmosphere not because of second sight, but because neglected sensory data has surfaced into your awareness. What gets described as extrasensory could be more accurately understood as extended sensory. Swart emphasizes that this framework is not uncontested fact. Scientists differ in where to draw sensory boundaries. Some lists stop at 20, some run beyond 30. Names change, definitions overlap, but the reality that experience runs on far more than 5 channels is no longer in doubt. Recognizing this broader structure challenges assumptions about what human minds can detect, and encourages a closer look at the filters that hide most of it from sight. And filters matter. They determine whether your world feels ordinary or uncanny, contained, or expanded. When those filters shift through training, fatigue, pharmacology, or overwhelming emotion, more of the background flow of data can slip into view. For some, that expansion is enlightening. For others, destabilizing. Yet the mechanism is the same. Changes in filtering alter perception. This insight brings us back to the human states that loosen those gates most dramatically. Because while meditation and training can open awareness gently, there are life events powerful enough to force the filters wide open without consent. And those events do not look on a brain scan like column expansion. They look like something else entirely. Can grief expand consciousness? Can grief actually expand consciousness? It's a question that sits at the center of both neuroscience and human experience. On the surface, grief looks destructive: disrupted sleep, surging cortisol, unpredictable shifts in dopamine and serotonin. Scans show the limbic system in overdrive, attention scattered, emotional regulation unstable. In another context, these same patterns might be red flags for a psychiatric disorder. Yet researchers like Dr. Swart argue it may not be simple collapse. The very neurochemical shifts that resemble breakdown could also loosen the brain's filters, temporarily letting in forms of awareness usually held at bay. The parallels with psychosis make this tension especially sharp. Both states involve unstable dopamine signaling, erratic frontal activation, and sometimes powerful mental imagery. In fact, early psychiatry often pathologized prolonged grief as if it were psychotic illness. But here is the distinction. Grief can create psychosis like neurochemical changes and vivid experiences while still allowing many people to function, caring for family, making decisions, returning to work. That difference in functionality matters. Instead of full breakdown, grief can be a mixed state, fragments of destabilization paired with abilities intact, allowing strange new awareness without complete collapse. It is within this gray zone that Swart's hypothesis emerges. She suggests grief loosens the brain's normally strict filtering system. Under everyday conditions, the nervous system edits reality aggressively, muting irrelevant sounds, background sensations, and fleeting symbols. In grief, filters weaken. Dreams sharpen. Recurrent patterns catch attention. Memories of the lost blur with vivid presence. These impressions, which the brain usually suppresses before conscious access, slip past defenses. For some, this heightened permeability feels like expansion. For others, it veers toward destabilization. Both are possibilities contained inside the same neural shifts. One way to picture this process is by looking at psychedelics. Substances like psilocybin disrupt serotonin signaling and quiet the brain's default mode network, the part that anchors identity and order. This quieting allows distant brain regions to connect, creating hyperconnectivity that produces images, insights, and a sense of encountering more than ordinary reality. Grief seems to mimic this naturally. Neurotransmitter storms loosen normal control, and perception becomes cross-linked in unusual ways. Modern studies even highlight supporting parallels. Near-death research has linked vivid experiences to REM intrusion into psychedelic-like patterns of network hyperconnectivity. In this light, grief may not simply mirror illness. It may generate a temporary altered state of consciousness produced internally by biology itself. By 2025, neuroimaging offered clearer data. fMRI work showed that when people remembered lost loved ones, regions involved in memory, like the hippocampus, became unusually coupled with sensory areas. In other words, emotional memory directly influenced perception, producing hybrid experiences that felt more like palpable encounters than imagined scenes. 2024 to 25 EEG studies document similar phenomena, transient bursts of wide brain connectivity showing activity patterns much like those measured in individuals under psychedelics or at the edge of life. These findings lend biological grounding to what many grieving people report, moments where dream, memory, and perception fuse tightly enough to create the sensation of contact. That distinction between dysfunction and expansion reframes the debate. Conventional psychiatry has often marked unusual perceptions as unwanted intrusions, evidence the brain's editing system has failed. Swart and others argue the opposite might be true in certain cases. Those intrusions could represent capacities the brain normally suppresses. A temporary flood of interconnection may not be damage. It may be a potential state, triggered under extraordinary circumstances. Importantly, this is not universal. For some individuals predisposed to psychiatric vulnerability, grief may be destabilizing rather than enlightening. The difference lies in whether loosening filters opens perception constructively or overwhelms it destructively. Another crucial finding is that these expanded states are temporary. Studies show they peak in the early months of loss and gradually fade over time. By 6 months to a year, networks return to baseline. Vivid encounters and uncanny dreams recede, replaced by steadier recall. Neuroscience can now trace this arc. Neurotransmitter storms settle, hyperconnectivity dissolves, filters resume their usual intensity. What feels mystical to the person aligns with measurable timelines in the brain. Expansion gives way to stabilization. This opens practical questions about how to respond. If grief generates altered states, not only emotional pain but enriched perception, should therapy suppress them at all costs? Or should it create safe ways to explore them? Some bereavement practices already aim to help people interpret symbolic dreams, recurring signs, or vivid presences without fear of insanity. Mindfulness approaches encourage awareness rather than avoidance, meeting strange perceptions as information rather than pathology. Framing grief strictly as dysfunction risk, invalidating experiences that may hold meaning. Framing it as a perceptual window acknowledges complexity. The line between adaptive and harmful remains slippery. For certain people, the same openness that allows moments of connection may also foster spirals of intrusive thoughts or paranoia. Distinguishing the two outcomes is where neuroscience can help. Imaging and neurotransmitter studies mark the difference between brains building temporary new bridges versus brains entering dangerous dysregulation. In this way, science provides tools for discernment, not to erase subjective experience, but to monitor when openness tips into illness. Instead of explaining these states as breakdown, a broader model views them as part of the brain's full repertoire, rarely accessed in ordinary life. They remind us that human consciousness is not fixed. It bends under certain circumstances, and those bends can produce clarity or chaos. By studying grief, neuroscience confronts the very edges of how perception is constructed. What emerges is a balanced picture. Grief is painful, destabilizing, and at times indistinguishable from illness. But it also sometimes expands awareness, softens filters, and lets hidden signals surface. For some, it generates creativity, symbolic understanding, even growth. For others, it leans toward confusion or despair. Both outcomes stem from the same biological shifts, the same loosening of the brain's editing system. What varies is how individuals engage with the altered state and how their networks stabilize once more. This perspective resonates with countless reports by grieving people who describe uncanny repetitions, sudden symbols, or moments of meaning impossible to ignore. Science does not need to prove those signs objectively real to understand their impact. The brain itself is primed under grief to notice patterns it would normally discard. What appears supernatural to one person may be the heightened perception of ordinary signals. This does not invalidate the experience. It reframes it as part of how an altered brain constructs reality in the wake of loss. And that brings us to a question most mourners eventually face. When the world begins to offer patterns, coincidences, or repetitions during grief, should they be dismissed as fantasy or honor as communication? Because when your brain has shifted into a state that notices everything, how do you decide which details matter? Signs or coincidence? Some experiences of loss leave people searching for signals, moments that might hold meaning beyond simple chance. This is where the question emerges. Are these encounters genuine signs, or are they coincidences that the mind elevates because it is looking for them? Consider the everyday version first. When you decide to buy a specific car and suddenly that same model seems to appear everywhere, it feels uncanny. Psychology explains this neatly with confirmation bias. Once your attention is fixed on something, your brain makes it stand out in the environment. It isn't that reality has changed. It's your filter that has shifted. In the context of grief, the same mechanism appears, but with much higher emotional weight. Dr. Swart took this principle and turned it into deliberate observation. Instead of waiting for random cues to surface, she chose to set the conditions herself. She asked for specific, unlikely symbols, things that would be unusual in her daily life and unmistakable when they showed up. One of those was the phoenix. For her, it represented renewal after destruction, a deeply personal metaphor for surviving loss. Once she had set this intention, the phoenix began to appear. Not constantly, but in places she would have easily overlooked before. A greeting card, a company logo, the cover of an art piece given as a gift. Each event could be dismissed as coincidence, and yet taken together, they looked harder to ignore. To understand why, it helps to point at how the brain directs attention. The brain's attentional filter, the reticular activating system and related thalamic hubs, controls what makes it into awareness. You are bombarded with sensory data all the time, but only a sliver reaches conscious thought. Mention the feeling of your left shoe, and suddenly you notice it. Before, it was there but ignored. Recent imaging studies, such as those at Yale, show that when attention locks onto a chosen target, shared deep brain hubs light up across different senses. The filter is not passive. You can bias it deliberately. What Dr. Swart was doing by choosing a phoenix was giving the filter precise instructions. By telling her brain this symbol has meaning, she entered it into the priority queue of attention. From then on, anything resembling a phoenix, however minor, was flagged up and pulled into awareness. The crucial point is not that phoenixes appear more often in the environment, but that her brain gave them salience. The world stayed the same. Her filter shifted. By 2025, researchers tested this idea in controlled studies that came to be called directed sign detection. Volunteers chose uncommon specific symbols, origami cranes, desert plants, oddly specific numbers, and recorded how often they noticed them over several weeks. Compared with control groups, participants consistently reported higher instances of seeing their chosen cues. Statistically, the increases were real. The act of asking primed awareness. Perception shifted because attention had been biased. The external environment didn't need to change for this effect to become visible. This is where grief intensifies the dynamic. For someone in mourning, a symbol spotted at just the right moment does not feel like car shopping or noticing logos. It lands with the emotional force of a message. Each sighting can feel direct, personal, even intimate. Neuroscience shows that once a chosen sign passes through the attentional filter, it doesn't stop at perception. It links to limbic regions, brain systems tied to memory and attachment. That means the phoenix on a card is not just a visual pattern. It is tied instantly to memories of a relationship, to the emotional charge of longing, to the need for connection. From the outside, it is trivial. From the inside, it feels equivalent to an encounter. Critics note these experiences can be explained without invoking external agency, confirmation bias, emotional salience, cognitive priming. The directed sign experiments prove as much. The effect is real but internal. Dr. Swart acknowledged this openly. She did not claim proof that the symbols reflected communication from beyond. Her position was that by asking, people are consciously working with the brain's filter system, what neuroscience already understands. That is measurable, repeatable, and defensible. The interpretive leap, whether these filter perceptions are mere coincidence or whether something larger responds, is not a scientific conclusion but a personal one. Still, the psychological benefits are clear. When grieving people ask for and notice signs, many report relief, comfort, and reduced anxiety. The act of searching itself becomes a stabilizing practice. A sign noticed at the day's lowest moment can restore focus. And since the RAS favors emotionally loaded cues, those chosen symbols carry more weight than neutral ones. A 2025 trial showed that participants who selected personally significant symbols felt improved mood across the weeks, while those who chose arbitrary shapes reported no such change. Emotion is a multiplier. It conditions what counts as relevant and how strongly it affects well-being. This helps explain why the practice spreads beyond grief. Many people casually report seeing the same number everywhere lately, or noticing coincidences tied to personal goals. These are everyday forms of filter bias, amplified by what matters emotionally in the moment. With grief, the effect is supercharged. The attentional system is already porous and heightened, and so directed perception can feel momentous. Swart's case illustrates it clearly. Standing in front of rows of cards, her filter lit up at the single one with a phoenix. From an observer's perspective, this was nothing more than paper and ink. From hers, it was presence and connection. Science can document the attentional shift, but it cannot fully measure how meaning is assigned. That is the gap between bias as data and comfort as lived experience. Both sides of the debate tend to overstate certainty. Skeptics sometimes dismiss every report as delusion. Meanwhile, believers sometimes present the same evidence as proof of a larger order responding. The more careful conclusion sits between them. Neuroscience shows that asking for signs changes what the brain highlights. That is undeniable. Whether you treat those highlights as private meaning or as communication lies in interpretation, not anatomy. And in many cases, the practical outcome, greater resilience, may matter more than the metaphysical verdict. Even humor underscores the principle. People laugh when someone says they got their sign from a clearance rack in a discount store. But the accuracy of the joke doesn't negate the mechanism. The sign mattered because the brain was primed for it, and the emotional link turned it into reassurance. Behind the humor sits biology, the brain's bias at work, and that biology exists in everyone's life. The deeper question is why human minds evolved such patterns of attention in the first place. To strategize, to survive, to connect, the system had to promote symbols, irregularities, and cues tied to meaning. Grief, stress, or longing bring those features forward. What seems like coincidence is the attentional system doing its job with more urgency, and the stronger the emotion, the stronger the highlight. For Dr. Swart, the issue was never whether the universe had rearranged itself on her behalf. It was whether intentional noticing could aid her brain in stabilizing after loss. By treating her attention system as programmable, by choosing her own symbol and allowing the brain to spotlight it, she demonstrated that perception can be shifted by will. The symbols comforted her not because they rewrote reality, but because they reorganized her internal experience of it. Science has always grappled with this divide, the difference between what can be measured in a lab and what is meaningful in a life. Directed signs fall neatly at the border. Evidence shows they arise from filtered perception. Meaning arrives when people connect those perceptions to memory and story. That duality captures their power. And yet this entire discussion is just one piece of a wider pattern, one where altered states, extraordinary experiences, and patterns of perception move from anecdote into research. Because while grief produces signs that can be explained as attentional filtering, there are other human experiences, equally common, that remain harder to reduce to cognitive bias alone. Some of them occur at the edge of life itself, in moments when the brain is thought to be shutting down, yet people return with strikingly clear reports that science still struggles to explain. Near-death experience statistics updated. By 2025, near-death experiences have become one of the most systematically cataloged phenomena in medical and psychological literature. Global databases now contain more than 10,000 well-documented accounts collected under structured conditions and often cross-referenced with hospital records. These are not simply scattered stories. They represent a critical mass of cases that follow repeating patterns. For researchers, the scale alone is significant. When this many accounts converge, the phenomenon can no longer be dismissed as coincidence or imagination, but must be examined as data with scientific weight. Across geography, language, and culture, the consistency remains difficult to ignore. Many report a sense of moving through a tunnel or enclosed passage, followed by encounter with a concentrated light described not as ordinary brilliance, but is infused with qualities of presence or intelligence. In numerous accounts, figures appear, sometimes deceased relatives, sometimes beings interpreted through the cultural framework of the experiencer. A frequent element is the so-called life review, in which individuals do not simply recall memories but re-experience them in panoramic form, often with emotional depth or from perspectives beyond their own. Such experiences are described with a clarity that contrasts with the fragmentation typical of hallucinations. Researchers also give special attention to the subset of cases that include veridical perception, accurate recall of events or details that should have been inaccessible at the time. These are reported in a smaller percentage of cases but remain striking. For example, one patient resuscitated after cardiac arrest described a medical team member dropping an instrument during surgery and uttering a brief remark of frustration. This detail was later corroborated by staff and took place during a period when the patient's EEG showed no detectable brain activity. Though rare, these reports raise challenging questions. Either some form of hidden residual brain function operates below current medical detection thresholds, or conscious awareness may under certain conditions extend beyond standard neural explanations. Statistical reviews of the database highlight clear clustering. Roughly 80% describe a tunnel effect. Over half include an encounter with beings of light. About a third involve life reviews of extraordinary vividness. Veridical perception has been documented in an estimated 15% of cases examined under structured protocols. What makes these numbers notable is their cross-cultural stability. An American teacher and a farmer in rural India may describe their encounters within different religious or symbolic narratives, yet the underlying structural features remain remarkably similar. That universality suggests an underlying process not easily attributed to individual fantasy. The nature of the reports has also become stronger in recent years due to methodological improvements. Earlier collections often relied on retrospective testimony, sometimes recorded weeks or months after the event, leaving room for suggestion or memory drift. More recent prospective studies invite patients to record or account immediately following resuscitation and compare those accounts against documented medical timelines. This shift reduces the possibility of confabulation. Yet even under these stricter conditions, the same themes emerge. This methodological advance reinforces the position that the phenomenon is structured and measurable. Equally revealing are the aftereffects. Near-death experiencers often describe a profound shift in values after recovery. Fear of death diminishes, empathy for others strengthens, and a sense of connection to something larger than everyday life often persists. Follow-up studies show increases in volunteer activity, adjustments in career priorities, and measurable declines in depression rates. These transformation patterns indicate how the experience functions not just as an isolated hallucination, but as an event that reorganizes personality and motivation. From a physiological standpoint, several hypotheses remain active, though none cover the full data. Oxygen deprivation is the most frequently cited. As neurons starve, they may fire erratically, producing visions or patterns. But hypoxic hallucinations usually appear chaotic, confusing, and distressing, unlike the coherent, structured, and emotionally positive narratives typical of near-death accounts. Another candidate is the release of neurochemicals like DMT or massive endorphin surges at the edge of life, which could support vivid internal imagery. Yet measurable human evidence for such surges remains limited, leaving this explanation speculative. Some researchers point to REM intrusion or other brain state crossovers as partial models, but even taken together, these hypotheses leave significant elements unexplained. The scientific caution remains sharp. No current evidence proves consciousness exists apart from the body. Yet the sheer coherence of these experiences during periods when brain activity registers silent poses a challenge to conventional models. The conservative interpretation suggests that forms of awareness may persist at subthreshold levels our equipment cannot yet detect. A more radical interpretation is that consciousness, under extreme conditions, may not be entirely confined to neuronal firing. Whichever position proves correct, the data themselves make one fact unavoidable. More study is needed, and the existing patterns already exceed the explanatory reach of simple hallucination models. The accumulated 10,000 accounts function as evidence, not proof. They show globally consistent phenomenology, lasting shifts in personal outlook, and in some cases, accurate perceptions that defy simple mechanistic accounts. They demonstrate that the question of how awareness behaves at the edge of death cannot be answered by ignoring the testimonies. Whether the mind is producing order from neurological collapse or accessing states, we do not yet understand. The result is the same. It requires systematic investigation. For medicine, the puzzle is not merely academic. Interpreting what is happening could reshape approaches to death and dying, influence how physicians support patients and families, and deepen our understanding of how consciousness functions under crisis. The implications are not limited to theory. They speak directly to care, human meaning, and how we define the boundaries of life itself. And yet, even in exploring these mysteries at the border of death, another phenomenon continues to puzzle researchers, one that does not occur during cardiac arrest, but often just hours before biological death itself. It is a state in which fading minds, even after years of silence or confusion, can suddenly return with startling clarity. Terminal lucidity, minds awakening before death. Terminal lucidity has become one of the most unsettling phenomena now on record. The sudden return of awareness, memory, and communication in people who, by all biomedical measures, should no longer be capable of those things. For families, the experience is astonishing. For clinicians, it is deeply perplexing. And for neuroscience, it represents a pattern that current models continue to struggle with. The episodes often unfold in ways that cut against years' decline. Patients with Alzheimer's or other severe degenerative conditions may spend months or years unable to form sentences, unresponsive to even basic questions, and apparently disconnected from everyone around them. Then, not long before death, sometimes hours, sometimes a day, they re-emerge. Families describe sudden recognition, intact conversations, even moments of humor or gratitude. The reappearance feels too complete to explain as random fragments of cognition. It feels like the return of the person themselves, only to vanish again as death follows shortly after. The medical literature, once skeptical, has started to catalog these events. By 2024 and 2025, journals were publishing structured case reports instead of treating the observations as oddities whispered among nurses. One case involved an 82-year-old woman with advanced Alzheimer's. For years, she had been silent and unresponsive, relying on staff for all basic care. Then, in her final hours, she suddenly sat upright, called her daughter by name, and began recalling shared memories. She thanked her family for their attention, spoke in clear sentences, and smiled with recognition. Moments later, she slipped back into quietness and passed away peacefully. Stories like this, though brief, carry immense impact, not only for families who witnessed them, but for researchers who must explain them. Structurally, the contradiction could not be starker. Alzheimer's destroys brain architecture. Protein plaques and tangles disrupt neuron activity. The hippocampus, critical for forming and retrieving memories, shows severe degeneration. Frontal regions needed for planning and fluent speech are compromised. Connections across the cortex fray until coordinated thought appears impossible. In the standard materialist model, when tissue is dismantled, function should be lost. And yet terminal lucidity demonstrates instances where memories and personality flow back despite structural destruction. That discrepancy forces the question, how could abilities that require intact networks resurface when those networks have long dissolved? Some researchers propose neurochemical explanations. They suggest that death may bring a surge of neurotransmitters, triggering increased activity in remaining neurons. Such a surge might produce brief arousal, sharpening awareness in the final hours. But this hypothesis encounters serious limitations. Neurotransmitter floods might cause heightened agitation or scattered imagery, but they cannot suddenly rebuild damaged architecture. They don't restore years of lost memory or coordinated speech pathways. Families report not just isolated words, but coherent dialogue, recognition, and expressive emotion, the exact faculties Alzheimer's was thought to erase irreversibly. The specificity of these recollections is what makes them especially striking. A person suddenly remembers a family member by name. They reference details from the shared past or express gratitude for care received. These are not hallucinated fragments or random phrases. They are evidence of structured memory and personality reasserting themselves. If such memories are still somehow stored within decayed neurons, why are they inaccessible for years and then recoverable at the edge of death? If they are not stored locally, then where does their return originate? The paradox remains open. For some clinicians and philosophers, these anomalies imply that the strict materialist account that mind is nothing beyond brain matter may be insufficient. Dr. Tara Swart has remarked that terminal lucidity raised the possibility that mind may not simply emerge from material matter, that personality might persist in ways not bound entirely to neurons. Professor Alexander Battani framed it similarly, suggesting that at the border of life and death, we may glimpse a truth normally hidden, that consciousness and body can sometimes operate independently. Others remain more cautious, warning that until further evidence emerges, we should not leap too quickly from unexplained anomalies to metaphysical conclusions. Both perspectives agree on one point: such cases demand careful, systematic research rather than dismissal. Importantly, terminal lucidity is not a universal occurrence, but it isn't vanishingly rare either. Clinical surveys indicate a notable minority, roughly 10 to 15% of patients with advanced neurological illness in some cohorts, experience these episodes shortly before death. That percentage is significant enough to challenge medical assumptions while reminding us that not every patient or family encounters it. In other words, it is a recognized pattern, not a norm. This measured description keeps discussions anchored in evidence while acknowledging the scope and consistency visible across health systems. For families, the experience goes far beyond science. Terminal lucidity is often described as a profound gift. A mother whose voice has been silent for a decade suddenly turns, makes eye contact, and thanks her children. A father who no longer remembered his own family unexpectedly asks about a loved one's well-being. These moments provide a sense of closure that nothing else can. They validate years of caregiving. They affirm bonds thought to be lost, and they allow a final conversation that becomes unforgettable. From a psychological standpoint, the comfort and connection provided are immense, regardless of underlying mechanism. For researchers, however, the puzzle still tightens. Memories without networks, language without intact pathways, personality without supportive structures. Each case puts pressure on the claim that identity is entirely built on the minutiae of neural circuits. Conventional models insist that function cannot exist without structure. Yet each lucid reappearance suggests function somehow surfaces even without supporting architecture. The scientific task now becomes whether to interpret this as evidence of undiscovered neurobiological processes, perhaps backup networks, hidden reserves, or fleeting reorganizations, or as an indication that consciousness cannot be fully contained by material descriptions alone. The philosophical implications are clear but remain unsettled. Some experts argue terminal lucidity may be best understood as anomalous brain activity we do not yet have instruments to detect. Others see in it a glimpse of something more profound, that mind and memory may not be entirely tethered to damaged brain matter. The debate is ongoing, and it reflects not just scientific caution, but the limits of current models. What all sides share is agreement that terminal lucidity belongs firmly in the record. It is not folklore, but an observed and replicable phenomenon that requires deeper study. In the end, terminal lucidity does not supply definitive proof of dualism, nor does it entirely shake the foundation of neuroscience. What it does is expose a gap, an experience that current brain-based explanations find deeply inadequate. It stands as an anomaly, one that has now been cataloged enough times to eliminate coincidence. At minimum, it shows that our understanding of the mind remains incomplete. At maximum, it suggests consciousness may not be reducible to matter in the tidy ways once assumed. Either way, it commands attention. Terminal lucidity, then, is best understood as a reminder that the mind may contain depths medical imaging cannot yet measure, a reminder that lived experience can challenge formal models, and a reminder that even at the threshold of death, cognition and identity can appear in forms that confound explanation. For scientists, this unsettles basic assumptions. For families, it provides a final transformative moment of connection. And for the wider human story, it raises the possibility that what we call consciousness may not be fully bounded by the material framework we have always assumed. That possibility, consciousness existing in forms not captured by conventional biology, has become increasingly relevant in other branches of science as well. Researchers outside palliative care are now searching for models that can account for awareness appearing beyond the brain's ordinary limits, and in recent years, one theoretical framework has shifted from fringe speculation towards serious laboratory investigation, offering a fresh lens on how consciousness might operate at its deepest levels. Quantum consciousness, a serious 2025 conversation. For decades, the suggestion that consciousness could involve quantum physics was dismissed outright. The very phrase quantum consciousness carried a stigma strong enough to derail careers. Neuroscience and physics occupied separate spaces, and anyone bridging them was usually ignored. Yet, as of 2025, the frontier has shifted slightly. Several labs, equipped with more sensitive imaging tools and quantum-level detectors, are beginning to test ideas that even 5 years earlier would not have made it into peer review. The conversation remains controversial, but its presence in respected journals signals that exploring such models is no longer categorically excluded. The experiments now underway focus on whether neurons can show behaviors that resemble what physicists call non-classical correlations. In physics, entanglement describes when particles link so strongly that changes in one appear immediately in the other, regardless of distance. Classical brain models assume such delicate states would vanish instantly in biological tissue. A brain is hot, wet, and chaotic in conditions thought to obliterate coherence. Yet in 2025, some research groups reported patterns in neuronal firings, separated across chambers or time, that appeared synchronized in ways not accounted for by standard electrical communication. To be clear, scientists themselves describe these as entanglement-like or quantum-compatible correlations, not undeniable evidence of entanglement in brains. The results are preliminary, debated, and remain under active investigation. One important caution: none of these studies demonstrate macroscopic, sustained entanglement in living human brains like a functioning quantum computer. The evidence so far is suggestive, not conclusive. What exists are anomalies, correlations that arise too quickly or in too coordinated a fashion to be comfortably explained by classical transmission alone. These observations do not prove that consciousness itself is quantum, but they are enough to encourage more research. Scientists who just 10 years ago would have rejected such work now agree it merits further testing. To see why this matters, think about the limits of classical signaling. Neurons typically exchange information through neurotransmitters crossing synapses, which takes measurable time. Processing chains across networks also involves sequential firing. That model explains local coordination but struggles with the subjective fact that consciousness appears unified, not scattered into hundreds of billions of separate signals. If non-classical correlations contribute in some way, they might help account for a seamless flow of awareness that arises from distributed neural activity. Quantum models don't provide answers yet, but they approach the unity of experience from another angle, suggesting integration could occur through links unconstrained by conventional time or space. Skepticism remains strong, largely because of how misused the concept has been in the past. Earlier advocates of quantum consciousness leaned heavily on metaphor, often without data, which left the idea branded as pseudoscience. What distinguishes current discussions is their grounding in experiments. Labs carefully rule out electromagnetic leakage, vibration, and chemical crosstalk, attempting to isolate whether any unexplained correlations remain. Some data do. Others do not replicate. The debate is now not whether the subject is legitimate, but how rigorous the tests must be. A helpful precedent comes from biology outside the brain. Birds are documented to use quantum effects in magnetoreception, allowing them to detect Earth's magnetic field through delicate entanglement in retinal proteins. Plants exploit quantum processes in photosynthesis, shelling energy with efficiencies that classical physics cannot fully explain. These examples show quantum coherence persisting in noisy biological conditions once thought impossible. If evolution has already harnessed quantum behavior in avian eyes or plant cells, the idea that neurons might exploit similar processes feels more plausible, though still unproven. For those studying grief, near-death experiences, or terminal lucidity, the implications are obvious. If consciousness uses processes not strictly bound to local signaling in space and time, then some reported experiences, such as sudden clarity in dying patients or panoramic life reviews, might have a framework. The key point is not validation of mystical claims, but loosening of scientific constraints. No longer does every unusual state need to be dismissed as neuronal failure. Instead, some could be tested against models that allow for coherence beyond classical limits. Time itself enters the discussion here. Classical cause and effect insist on a strict sequence. Quantum theory, in certain experiments, allows correlations that defy clean temporal order. If similar processes influence perception, then nonlinear experiences, such as reliving decades within a few moments, could reflect altered access to information, not just hallucination. Again, this does not establish proof. It simply suggests that biology may shelter processes that map onto physics already known for strange temporal effects. The resistance remains anchored in good reasons. A human brain is not a vacuum-isolated particle trap. It is a warm, electrically noisy system constantly in flux. These conditions should rapidly degrade quantum states. Most neuroscientists remain cautious and emphasize that the evidence is far from showing robust, functional coherence in humans. But the fact that empirical data suggest even transient non-classical correlations challenges the prior certainty that such phenomena were impossible. The shift is not from certainty to proof, but from dismissal to curiosity, and curiosity is the engine of new research. Language in publications reflects this transition. Articles once avoided the term quantum altogether, preferring safe euphemisms. By 2025, papers cautiously reference non-classical or quantum-compatible findings. Discussions now ask whether results persist across labs, what variables disrupt them, and whether they extend to intact brains rather than isolated neuron cultures. Debate turns toward replication and methodology, not ideological rejection. That is a substantial cultural shift within science itself. What does this mean outside of the lab? For the public, quantum talk often veers into mystical imagery, which muddies understanding. The more careful point is that consciousness may involve physics beyond classical models, but this remains an open question. If true, it could explain why awareness feels unified and sometimes expansive. If false, the research will close those doors. Either way, the prospect reframes the field. The human mind may not be entirely accounted for by 20th century neuroscience. None of this says that consciousness has been proven quantum in nature. The possibility that quantum processes contribute to brain function is being tested, not confirmed. If even a small role exists, it would force reconsideration of awareness, but the evidence is far from settled. What we can say is that experiments have reached a threshold where data exists to support continuing inquiry. For the first time, the claim is not speculation alone, but a tension between observation and explanation. And while these debates focus on neurons and physics, another front in consciousness research has been gaining equal traction. If the last discussion centered on whether the mind might extend beyond classical models, the next concern shifts attention back inside the body itself, where evidence shows that memory and trauma are not only stored in awareness, but stored into tissue, muscles, and even microbiomes. This calls into question how much of human consciousness is shaped from below by the body itself, influencing mind and perception in ways we are only beginning to measure. The body keeps more than the score. When scientists talk about trauma today, they are no longer willing to confine it to the brain. Current research shows that traces of trauma may also persist in the body, embedded in muscles, fascia, circulation, and even within the composition of the gut microbiome. The body is not a passive backdrop. It can preserve trauma in postures, breathing patterns, and digestive imbalances long after the triggering events pass. This recognition has reshaped the way clinicians think about healing. Mind alone is not the whole picture. One explanatory model emerging from this shift is what some researchers call the serotonin capillary hypothesis of trauma storage. It suggests that trauma may be reflected physiologically through fine-scale vascular constriction. Capillaries that normally release nutrients into fascia and muscle appear to constrict, altering the flow of serotonin and other neurotransmitters outside the central nervous system. Instead of serotonin being a brain-only messenger, evidence has accumulated that it circulates widely through the whole body, regulating tone, tissue repair, and resilience. When vascular networks remain restricted, trauma may persist physically through chemical imbalances and postural rigidity. In this view, cells themselves can maintain traces of stress that the conscious mind may no longer access directly. From that framework, the effectiveness of seemingly simple practices begins to make more sense. Singing, drumming, chanting, yoga, and breath-based exercises all work by engaging respiration, vibration, and movement that reopen these pathways. They stimulate the vagus nerve, one of the main mediators connecting brain to body, altering parasympathetic function and shifting serotonin flows. What once looked like cultural ritual can be measured as physiological reset. For instance, controlled breathwork targeting slow, rhythmic exhalations has been shown to modify vagal tone and even decrease inflammation markers in blood samples. This does not mean that such techniques erase trauma completely, but it does show their role in loosening the body patterns that help hold it in place. Seen through this lens, cultural mourning practices take on new relevance. Human groups across history have wailed, drummed, and moved together when facing loss. The Greeks tore garments and struck their chests. West African communities circled in percussion and movement. Irish traditions used keening, collective wailing that sustained for hours. Across cultures, the gestures included loud vocalizations and rhythmic body motion. Modern science interprets these not as random customs, but as large muscle activation and vocal engagement mechanisms that stimulate the vagus nerve and parasympathetic system. What looked like symbolic ritual is now understood as functional biology. This perspective also affects how clinicians think about patient resistance in therapy. When someone cannot explain where their anxiety comes from, or feels surges of anger out of proportion to the situation, the problem may not lie in conscious thought but in tissue patterns. Fascia, once considered inert scaffolding, is now recognized as a sensory network dense with nerve endings. When it becomes dehydrated and rigid, it restricts posture and circulation in ways that maintain emotional tension. Likewise, gut microbiome studies reveal that prolonged stress shifts microbial populations, changing serotonin and dopamine production. This means that trauma may evolve into a whole-body imprint, visible in posture, expressed in microbiome chemistry, and sustained by the circulatory system. The gut-brain axis is where this becomes especially clear. Messages between the gastrointestinal tract and the brain travel largely along the vagus nerve, influencing emotion, perception, and safety signals. Popular phrases about gut feelings reflect more than metaphor. Microbial imbalances shift neurochemical availability, altering mood and reactivity. In trauma patients, microbiome diversity becomes measurably reduced, and this correlates with higher anxiety and depressive symptoms. Recognizing this connection has broadened treatment models to include nutrition and microbial support as active components of trauma work. What once would have been left to informal advice, eat better, rest, hydrate, is now part of structured medical protocols. Body-centered methods have begun taking central stage in therapy because of these findings. Yoga, stretching, and other somatic techniques not only move the body, but restore flexibility to fascia and circulation. Rhythmic drumming and chanting create chest and abdominal vibrations that stimulate vagal pathways. Singing recruits both memory and controlled breath, which regulate heart rhythm while altering stress chemistry. None of these approaches alone acts as a cure, and clinicians stress that outcomes vary. But EEG and fMRI scans during such practices confirm measurable shifts in networks linked to regulation, relaxation, and memory processing. The body is not a passive container, but an active site of repair. These insights also clarify the limits of talk therapy. Verbal processing can reframe and organize thought, but it does not reach fascia tension, circulation restriction, or microbial imbalance. A person might intellectually accept their losses yet continue to feel an ache in their chest or clench their shoulder muscles years later. To address that unresolved stress, bodywork and somatic practices are required. Trauma therapy in modern clinics is therefore becoming multi-layered, combining psychotherapy with yoga sessions, nutrition counseling, craniosacral treatments, or guided breath practices. The integration recognizes that the nervous system is not sealed off from the tissues that house it. For many patients, this understanding brings relief. People who feel they are failing therapy because they cannot talk their way out of grief learn that their bodies are holding patterns of stress that need a different pathway of release. The framework helps dismantle stigma and creates more compassionate models of care. It also adds legitimacy to traditions once dismissed as unscientific. Wailing and ritualized grieving now appear to have as much neuroscientific validity as structured therapy sessions. As Dr. Swart put it with humor, a grandmother's funeral songs may have aligned with vagal stimulation more precisely than many modern techniques. In professional practice, fascia has become a particular focus. Once thought of as passive connective fiber, it is now mapped as a sensory organ in its own right, rich with mechanoreceptors. Restricted fascia interferes with movement and breathing, creating physical imprints of trauma. Hydration, stretching, massage, and craniosacral therapies restore its flexibility and improve circulation. This release often coincides with psychological relief. Patients report emotions resurfacing alongside physical relaxation. Trauma, like memory, may be distributed through the medium that lies at the borders of every muscle and organ. By 2025, recognition of body-based trauma is no longer fringe. Clinics are revising intake procedures, asking not just what patients think or feel, but how they breathe, where they hold tightness, which foods or conditions upset their digestion. Neuroimaging and gut sequencing support this approach, demonstrating that symptoms cluster across mind and body. Treatment programs integrate movement, group singing, mindfulness around food, and longer-term nutritional repair. These additions do not replace traditional therapy, but deepen it, resolving aspects that words alone cannot reach. The shift does more than broaden clinical methods, it reframes the meaning of resilience. Healing is not only about new ways of thinking, but about retraining communication networks across the whole self. Trauma may live in capillaries, fascia, gut bacteria, and breath as much as in memory. Recovery, in turn, depends on bringing those hidden imprints into renewed circulation. Society once believed grief could be confronted only through reflection or speech. Science today shows that recovery includes movement, rhythm, breath, and the subtle ecologies inside the body. The larger implication is that practices once relegated to ritual or alternative health often targeted mechanisms we can now measure scientifically. By combining clinical therapy with structured somatic work, patients are learning that perception, emotion, and bodily state can shift together. And if healing follows this pattern, where repeated physical practice changes inner communication, then perception itself may be a skill that can be trained, just like any muscle. Training the communication muscle. Training the communication muscle begins with the premise that perception is not fixed. It can be conditioned. Dr. Swart describes it as a practice that requires steady effort, the same way working out or learning a language does. You cannot rely on chance encounters with meaning if you want to consistently detect patterns. Instead, you train awareness through repetition until your nervous system learns to flag signals you once ignored. Swart organizes this training into 3 practical pillars: noticing, reconnecting with nature, and developing intuition. Each one shapes awareness differently, but together they expand perception in measurable ways. The first is the art of noticing. In everyday life, people filter out most of what surrounds them. We hurry through errands, answer messages, and focus only on tasks that demand attention. Small repetitions, like the same word appearing in conversations or particular numbers surfacing throughout the day, tend to slip by. Noticing reverses that habit. It means deliberately scanning for detail, allowing your mind to register patterns instead of dismissing them as background noise. Over weeks, your eye becomes trained to catch finer cues, facial microexpressions, small shifts in tone between speakers, or anomalies that repeat across unrelated moments. This is not mystical, but practical. Psychologists describe it as moving from merely surviving to thriving, because people who broaden awareness often identify opportunities or information that others overlook. A simple way of practicing is to choose an uncommon symbol, like a crane, a particular flower, or a phrase, and quietly track when it appears in your week. Keep a log. This is not about proving external forces, but about sharpening attention. Each time the chosen cue appears, you're rewarding your brain's ability to detect signals it usually ignores. Studies in 2025 showed that people who practiced this kind of intention-based noticing detected their chosen symbol far more often than control groups, and their mood scores and resilience levels improved during the same period. That result suggests that deliberate attention reshapes not just perception, but well-being. The second pillar is immersion in natural environments. This is not simply about enjoying scenery, but about recalibrating the brain's filter. City life bombards us with artificial rhythms, screens, deadlines, alarms that train the nervous system to prioritize speed over depth. Nature interrupts that tempo. A walk in the woods introduces slower patterns, bird calls layered across space, light shifting through leaves or the rhythm of water. These subtle dynamics require a different kind of attention, one less frantic and more patient. Scientific work in 2025 showed that even a single hour outdoors each week made participants more attuned to patterns and improved their recall of small details later on. The suggestion is that outdoor rhythms restore sensory balance, making you more likely to notice hidden cues in other contexts as well. This immersion also reconnects physiology with larger cycles. Circadian rhythms align with sunlight. Internal states shift according to sound and temperature, and nervous system activity synchronizes with natural surroundings. Many people find this is where moments of communication or signs feel clearest. Whether it is the sudden presence of an animal crossing, the echo of repeated sounds, or the timing of encounters, the context seems heightened. From a laboratory perspective, the explanation is simpler. Time outside boosts baseline sensory resolution, allowing more information to rise above the normal filters. The third practice is training intuition. Unlike noticing or walking outdoors, intuition involves internal listening. Neuroscience links intuition tightly to interoception, the unconscious sensing of internal body states like heartbeat, respiration, or stomach tension. People often dismiss gut feelings, yet research shows that these fast embodied signals are often accurate indicators of environmental shifts before reasoning has caught up. Training intuition means slowing down long enough to register those signals consciously. Practical exercises involve pausing before decisions. Ask yourself a question, then simply scan the body for responses. Does your chest tighten? Does your breathing deepen? Does your stomach ease or tense? Over time, these somatic reactions become more distinct. By logging them against outcomes, what choices prove wise, which situations proved harmful, you build a calibrated sense of what your body is trying to say. After several months, patterns emerge that help guide decisions. The mechanism is not mystical. It is rapid internal data processing routed to physical sensation. But when trained, it looks like an additional perceptual layer, one that feels like intuition. Together, these three pillars, art of noticing, immersion in natural rhythms, and intuition training form Swart's approach to developing what she calls the sign muscle. The training is incremental. At first, spotting repetitions feels trivial. Symbols appear by coincidence. Sensations seem unclear. But after sustained practice, filters shift and perception sharpens. Events you would otherwise miss begin standing out. In personal accounts and controlled trials alike, individuals report a growing clarity in distinguishing between noise and meaningful signals. This process is not just about expanded perception, but about mental health outcomes. Researchers reviewing structured practice routines in 2025 reported that people who actively train awareness through noticing and intuition exercises showed heightened mood resilience. Many participants described greater optimism, reduced anxiety, and a stronger sense of purpose. The mechanism appears to be that seeing patterns reinforces meaning, and human well-being strongly correlates with a sense of meaning. So the benefit is double. Perception increases, and emotional stability improves. A reinforcing cycle develops quickly. Whenever the brain identifies a pattern, it generates a dopamine reward. That reward creates motivation to notice more, which makes the practice self-sustaining. After several weeks, the act of training perception is no longer about chasing results, but about enjoying the process itself. Events feel connected. Fragmentation eases. Isolation softens into a sense of participation in a broader pattern, whether you interpret it as communication or as brain-based meaning-making. The loop continues because the reward system strengthens the habit. Still, Swart stresses the importance of balance. Intentionally training for signs carries the risk of sliding into excessive self-interpretation. Psychologists warn that open filters without grounding can lead to overreading random events. To avoid this, she emphasizes community as an anchor. Sharing experiences with others creates reality checks. Friends or groups can validate moments that resonate widely while flagging those that may be personal projections. Engaging in open conversation helps maintain perspective while still supporting the sense of connection. In this way, community not only offers comfort, but provides safeguards against cognitive drift. With these checks in place, the practice remains constructive. Rather than drifting toward overinterpretation, people can engage in structured exercises. One simple experiment is a 7-day noticing challenge. Choose a rare symbol, keep track each day where it appears, and note the feelings associated with each recognition. At the end of the week, compare with a peer or community member, discuss overlaps, and see how perception has shifted. The goal is not to prove anything metaphysical, but to become aware of how attention can be guided and how interpreting those moments affects emotional state. Framed this way, training the communication muscle is not extraordinary or unscientific. It is incremental conditioning of attention, grounded in established psychological and physiological processes. Evidence confirms that intention changes what rises through. Filters, and those shifts influence both perception and well-being. What remains open to interpretation is whether those noticed moments are purely inner bias or partly responses from something larger. But whichever conclusion one prefers, the practical outcomes are immeasurable. As participants strengthen this skill, they often describe it as gaining an additional channel of communication in their daily life. The actual mechanism, whether biological, psychological, or something beyond, remains unresolved. But what has been verified is the shift itself and its connection to resilience and purpose. The question that follows, however, is how such practices are perceived by the broader scientific community. Because when people describe experiences at the edges of perception, especially in grief or near-death states, the immediate reaction is often skepticism. And that skepticism, while understandable, carries its own set of risks. Why this isn't just woo the scientific risk. Dismissing thousands of consistent reports risks ignoring data, and bad science ignores anomalous data. When people hear about after-death communication or visions during near-death states, skepticism is the default response. It feels safer to attribute them to hallucinations, stress, or oxygen deprivation. Grief heightens our sensitivity to patterns, so perhaps these experiences are only the mind reaching for order. That perspective sits comfortably inside existing models. Yet comfort should not be confused with completeness. If reports continue to accumulate in structured patterns, then filtering them out is not scientific caution. It is refusal to investigate anomalies that may hold insights into the nature of mind and survival. There are real dangers at both poles. On one side, uncritical belief in transcendence opens the door to exploitation or misguided certainty, where people may mistake coincidence for proof. On the other, absolutist dismissal blocks legitimate exploration. Science has always been altered by uncomfortable data points. When falling stones from the sky were first described, scientists laughed until meteorites filled museum shelves. Germs were dismissed as invisible folklore until microscopes provided a lens. Brain plasticity was once considered absurd, yet it is now the foundation for therapies worldwide. In each case, ridicule did not eliminate the evidence, it only delayed recognition. Experiences that press against current models may be carrying signals for the next round of discovery. Some researchers point out contradictions that challenge simplistic neurological explanations. Hypoxia, or oxygen deprivation, should yield confusion, fragmentary imagery, and hallucinatory distortion. Yet near-death narratives more often describe clarity, ordered sequences, coherent environments, and in some cases verifiable details of external events. That is not what failing neurons normally produce. The mismatch matters because it undermines the claim that such reports can be explained away as ordinary delirium. Accounts from surgical patients sometimes even include specific observations corroborated by staff. These examples raise questions that conventional explanations cannot fully resolve. To study them is not to confirm life after death, but to honor the role of anomalous data in refining scientific understanding. Others stress the need to rethink what medicine means when it declares someone dead. Critical care specialists argue that death unfolds as a process, not a cliff. For centuries, a stopped heart was considered the final mark, but modern resuscitation has reopened that boundary. Advances in hypothermia protocols, oxygenation, and monitoring now show that awareness can persist into the early minutes of cardiac arrest. This means patients who describe lucidity after flatlines may not be outside of biology at all. They may occupy an overlooked territory at the border of dying, where perception remains possible in ways medicine has not yet mapped. Large-scale surveys add further weight. Psychiatric research over decades has noted that between 10 and 20% of people who come near death report structured and emotionally meaningful experiences. That percentage is far too high to dismiss as cultural suggestion. The consistency has already been documented across hospitals, continents, and religions. What remains ambiguous is mechanism, but presence of a repeatable effect is not in doubt. For researchers operating within evidence-based frameworks, that consistency becomes data. Ignoring it undermines the very standard science demands. The taboo dimension is especially significant. For professionals like neuroscientist Dr. Swart, the risk is not that people report these experiences, but that stigma silences them. Historically, individuals with accounts of voices, visions, or presences risk being medicated or institutionalized. That same stigma persists in academic spaces. Researchers who study post-loss experiences or near-death cognition still face reputational danger. And yet, discounting people's testimony before even measuring it produces systematic data loss. If entire domains of experience go unrecorded because they trigger ridicule, then neuroscience operates with a partial sample. That silence shields current models rather than test them, a profound inversion of what science is meant to do. The published work of surgeons and psychiatrists who have survived their own near-death experiences underscores this. One neurosurgeon argued that his own event convinced him the brain may operate more like a filter than a generator, shaping what awareness can reach the surface but not producing consciousness itself. Critics see this as speculative, yet as a model, it directly addresses why coherent experiences surface in moments when the brain appears offline. The mind is not being created by wet gray matter alone, but filtered through it. Whether one agrees or not, the idea is at least consistent with the anomalous reports. To banish discussion solely because it exceeds a dominant paradigm constrains knowledge unnecessarily. Commentary in scientific publications has already raised the possibility that the brain, a common model, may require revision. If some form of awareness continues when detectable neural activity has ceased, then dualistic or post-material hypotheses cannot be brushed off as pseudoscience. They must be staged alongside classical accounts as testable alternatives. That shift feels threatening because it rearranges deep assumptions, but scientific rigor demands it. The alternative is a calcified model preserved for comfort rather than accuracy. True rigor acknowledges discrepancy. Every map in science adjusts when territory shows features it cannot ignore. Even hard data complicates the picture. In 2023 and 2024, researchers including Jima Borgian reported bursts of organized brain activity in dying patients, brief surges of gamma rhythms linked to perception and awareness. Though interpretations vary, these findings demonstrate that end-of-life brain states are far more dynamic than previously thought. Instead of clean shutdown, there may be windows of heightened coherence right before death. Debate continues over what these patterns mean, but they show that even biological facts at the threshold resist simple closure. More evidence of anomaly, not less, is accumulating. Taken together, these developments point to a spectrum of positions, not consensus. Some emphasize organized reports inconsistent with hypoxia. Others focus on the process character of death. Still others highlight statistical consistency across cultures. The important point is not agreement on mechanism, but recognition of anomalies that defy easy fit inside the classical model. Treating such reports as delusion or noise may feel disciplined, but that discipline is hollow if it erases data. Treating them instead as signals, provisional, messy, but repeated, follows the core method science has always used to evolve. The choice before science is not whether to believe in survival after death. It is whether to examine structured evidence seriously or to dismiss it because outcomes discomfort current theory. One position leads to progress, whether that progress upholds conventional materialist models or demands revision. The other leads to dead ends. For researchers, doctors, and ordinary people alike, the difference is shaped less by belief than by willingness. Skepticism will remain, but skepticism of models should never harden into censorship of data. This is why some researchers insist that taking anomalous reports seriously is itself the more scientific path. Belief may be optional. Investigation is not. Structured reports from thousands of people, documented across medical settings, demand attention. Every new piece of imaging or end-of-life monitoring confirms that the threshold between awareness and death is not settled. Each anomaly is pressure for knowledge to expand. Discomfort cannot be an excuse to deny that expansion. For those who care about science, the motivating principle is simple. Structured anomalies require structured response. More measurement, more record-keeping, more controlled study, not less. Ignoring anomalies would mean medicine and neuroscience deliberately select only the data that confirms their theories. That is not skepticism, it is bias. The scientific risk is not in exploring the impossible. The risk lies in pretending the question does not exist. And for anyone curious and science-minded, the conclusion is straightforward. The real mark of science is engaging anomalies instead of discarding them. To investigate strange reports is disciplined. To suppress them is unscientific. The response that honors the evidence is to look directly and test what is there. Because if even fragments of these experiences prove valid, then the story of awareness may be larger than we have drawn so far, and that larger story may hold the next real frontier of discovery. The latest 2025 research suggests consciousness could be more expansive than once believed, and that grief, near-death accounts, and unusual states of awareness are legitimate phenomena worth scientific study. This does not mean we have proof of an afterlife. It means patterns are emerging that deserve careful attention rather than dismissal. Grief, so often defined only by suffering, may also act as a catalyst for altered perception, allowing people to experience clarity, symbols, and connection that feel transformative. We don't have final answers yet, but the data demand attention. That's the real headline. If this topic fascinated you, share one experience or question in the comments. And if you want more, hit subscribe for balanced deep dives into the latest research.